Caroline met the Count's steady, aloof gaze at the altar, her thoughts fixed not on the marital vows but on the single necessary word, Countess. The title was the sole piece of currency she purchased today. The bankrupt, quiet man beside her was merely the vessel necessary to deliver it. She had no idea that 3 weeks later, while searching his crumbling estate for forgotten silver to sell, she would stumble onto a sealed cavern in the moorland and discover that her penniless husband was hiding a gold mine vast enough to make her the wealthiest woman in all of England. If you're ready to enjoy this story, click that subscribe button, like this video, and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more wonderful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get into the story. The nave of St. James's Church was a suffocating cavern of gilded triumph. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the stained glass, casting rich but hazy colours onto the massive crowd of London society that had gathered to witness the union of Lady Caroline Whitford and Count Nathaniel Carow. The atmosphere was one of forced celebration, masking the desperate financial manoeuvres that had made this wedding possible. Lady Caroline Whitford moved with practiced, effortless grace on her father's arm, a vision of serene, calculated beauty in her elaborate pink gown and cascading ropes of pearls. Her hand, resting lightly on his sleeve, did not tremble, but the meticulous smile fixed on her lips felt like a fragile piece of porcelain. She was 27, endowed with quiet intelligence and a deep-seated loyalty that had been twisted by necessity into cold pragmatism. Her family had spent their last reserves to make this spectacle perfect. A desperate, final show to distract the hundreds of critical eyes from the whisper of their ruin. Every courtier and gossip knew the truth. Caroline was respectable but financially negligible. Count Nathaniel Carow was the opposite, a bankrupt aristocrat whose land holdings were vast, but whose liquid assets were zero. He was a man drowning in debt, yet his title, Count of Carow, was ancient and undeniable. Caroline, raised to believe that status was the only true currency, had engineered this match. As the organ music swelled, pulling her toward the future, Caroline heard only the echo of her own resolve. The Count, tall, reserved, and intimidating in his absolute silence, stood waiting at the altar. His reputation preceded him, a man burdened by secrets and failure. She finally stood beside him. His proximity was intense, his reserve absolute. As their eyes briefly met before the ceremony began, Caroline felt a profound chill, a chilling affirmation of the bargain. Her thoughts fixed not on the sanctity of the vows, but on the single, necessary word, Countess. The title was the sole piece of currency she purchased today. The bankrupt, quiet man beside her was merely the vessel necessary to deliver it. The transaction was complete, and she had sold herself well. The ceremony proceeded with chilling efficiency. Caroline watched as Nathaniel's snobbish sister-in-law, Evelyn Marbury, fanned herself too aggressively, exchanging a look of pitying contempt with her arrogant husband Charles Marbury. They had mocked Caroline for marrying down, convinced that the Count's inevitable ruin would take her down with him, reinforcing Caroline's belief that only titles and status held genuine worth. "I pronounce you man and wife." The declaration was the catalyst. It bound her to the Count and to his ruin. Moments later, the society clamour safely behind them, Caroline was ushered into a private carriage. Nathaniel followed, the silence between them heavier than the weight of her elaborate wedding ring. There would be no wedding breakfast, no celebratory ball. Nathaniel finally spoke, his voice dry and devoid of inflection. "Our arrangements stand, Countess. We depart immediately for the Carow estate. I trust you are prepared for the austerity." Caroline met his gaze, her tone matching his measured precision. "I am prepared for the reality of the title, Count." Their journey was swift and stark, an escape more than a honeymoon. They travelled away from the glittering, judging eyes of London, moving toward the remote, bleak region that housed the Carrow ancestral seat. Nathaniel had been honest. The house was crumbling, barely habitable, and entirely without liquid funds. The reality of penury had begun. Caroline braced herself. She had the title, but now she had to use her quiet intelligence to secure the future she had bought, determined to make the name Countess Carrow mean more than social wreckage. It wasn't until 3 weeks later, during a desperate search of the dilapidated estate's old library for forgotten silver to sell, that her life was irrevocably shattered, not by ruin, but by fortune. She didn't find silver. She found a century-old cryptic map hidden by a previous count. Following the map's strange markings, she stumbled onto a sealed-off cavern on the rugged moorland and into the blinding, unbelievable light of a vast, secret gold mine. In that instant, everything changed. Caroline Whitford, the woman who married for a title, was now, by law of marriage, the Countess Carrow, and potentially the richest woman in all of England. The problem was that the discovery only intensified the danger. The gold was a state secret, kept hidden by Nathaniel to prevent seizure by the crown. Her cynical transactional marriage had just become a lethal, staggering partnership, and the Count, the man she married for his empty name, was the only person who could help her protect the fortune that made her queen. The carriage lurched forward, and London began to recede behind them like a gilded wound closing over. Caroline sat rigid against the worn velvet seat, her elaborate pink gown pooling around her in cruel contrast to the carriage's threadbare interior. The vehicle itself was a confession. Old, respectable, but visibly declining. No fresh lacquer, no family crest polished to gleaming, just serviceable bones holding together a dying legacy. Nathaniel sat opposite her, his long frame folded into the narrow space with the practiced economy of a man accustomed to making himself smaller than his circumstances. He had not spoken since his terse announcement about their departure. His gaze remained fixed on the passing streets. Though Caroline suspected he saw nothing of them, he was somewhere else entirely, trapped in calculations she could not yet fathom. She studied him in the grey light filtering through the smudged window. 33 years old according to the marriage documents. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of severe handsomeness that might have been striking if it weren't so deliberately shuttered. His dark hair was neat but unfashionable, his coat well cut but at least 3 seasons old. Everything about him spoke of a man preserving appearances through sheer, stubborn will. The silence stretched between them, thick and unyielding. Caroline's mother had warned her in those desperate final weeks of negotiation that the Count was not a man of warmth. "He is practical," her mother had said, as though practicality were a virtue that could substitute for affection. "You are practical too, Caroline. You will manage." Manage. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. "How far is the estate?" Caroline finally asked, her voice cutting through the silence with deliberate precision. She would not sit mute like a purchased object being transported to its new shelf. Nathaniel's gaze shifted to her, and for a moment she saw something flicker behind his guarded expression. Surprise, perhaps, that she had spoken first. 3 days by road. We will stop at coaching inns along the way. Modest ones. Naturally. She kept her tone neutral, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch at the word modest. She had spent her entire life navigating the razor's edge between respectability and poverty. She knew modest. She knew worse than modest. "You should understand something, Countess." He spoke the title like a warning, not an endearment. The situation at Carrow is not merely strained, it is dire. The house has been without proper staff for 2 years. The grounds are neglected. There will be no luxuries, no society, no diversions. If you came expecting anything beyond survival, you will be disappointed. Caroline met his eyes directly, refusing to look away. I came expecting a title, Count. You have delivered it. Everything else is my concern to manage. Something shifted in his expression. A fractional softening, or perhaps merely reassessment. He inclined his head slightly, as though acknowledging a worthy opponent across a chessboard. Then we understand each other. Do we? The question escaped before she could stop it. Sharper than intended. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. We understand enough. The carriage rattled on, carrying them further from the world Caroline had known. She watched the grand townhouses give way to smaller dwellings, then to open countryside dotted with farms and hedgerows. Each mile was a severance. From her mother's sickbed, from the creditors circling like patient vultures, from every person who had watched her walk down that aisle with pity disguised as admiration. She thought of Evelyn Marbury's pitying smirk during the ceremony, the way Charles had leaned toward his wife to whisper something that made them both suppress cruel laughter. They expected her to fail. They expected this marriage to be her burial, not her resurrection. Caroline's fingers tightened on the worn fabric of her traveling cloak. She would not give them the satisfaction. The steward, she said, breaking another stretch of silence. You mentioned a steward who has maintained the estate in your absence. Nathaniel glanced at her, a flicker of wariness entering his eyes. Marshal Keaton. He has served the Carrow family for 20 years. He is reliable. The hesitation was slight, but Caroline caught it. There was something more to this steward, something Nathaniel was not saying. She filed the observation away, adding it to the growing catalogue of questions she would need answered. I look forward to meeting him, she said simply. Nathaniel returned his gaze to the window. He will be essential to our survival. I trust him implicitly. The emphasis on the word trust was unmistakable. A boundary drawn, a territory marked. Nathaniel trusted his steward. He did not, the implication was clear, trust his new wife. Caroline accepted this without offense. Trust was earned, not bestowed. She had not trusted him either when she spoke her vows. She had merely calculated that his title outweighed his poverty. Now they were bound together by law and desperation, 2 strangers sharing a sinking ship. As the countryside grew wilder and the roads rougher, Caroline allowed herself one small, private thought. She had not married this man for love, but she had married him for survival. And Caroline Whitford, no, Caroline Carrow now, had survived far worse than a silent husband and a crumbling estate. She would find a way to make this title mean something. She would find a way to turn this calculated sacrifice into something resembling victory. The carriage carried them north, toward the unknown, toward austerity, toward the secrets that the Count of Carrow held locked behind his impenetrable silence. Neither of them could have guessed what those secrets would reveal. The vestibule of St. James's Church offered no sanctuary. Caroline had barely stepped away from the altar, her hand resting with forced lightness on Nathaniel's rigid arm, when Evelyn Marbury materialized before them, like a perfumed viper emerging from silk. Countess Carrow. Evelyn pronounced the title with exaggerated sweetness, her lips curling around the words as though tasting something faintly spoiled. How utterly transformative. One moment a Whitford of diminishing prospects, the next a countess of... Well, she let the sentence hang, unfinished but unmistakable. Charles Marbury flanked his wife, his expression one of practiced condescension. He was Nathaniel's cousin by marriage, connected through some distant branch of the family tree that apparently granted him license to sneer at the main trunk. His waistcoat was immaculate, his cravat tied with mathematical precision, every detail calculated to announce his superior fortune. "Nathaniel," Charles said, inclining his head with the barest minimum of courtesy. "We were surprised to receive the invitation. Given your circumstances, we assumed any ceremony would be a quiet affair. A registry office, perhaps. Witnesses pulled from the street." Caroline felt Nathaniel stiffen beside her, but his voice remained flat, betraying nothing. "The Whitfords preferred a traditional ceremony. I saw no reason to deny them." "How generous of you." Evelyn's fan snapped open, fluttering against the warm air of the crowded vestibule. "Spending what little remains on spectacle. Though I suppose when one has nothing left to lose, extravagance becomes almost logical." The insult was delivered with such practiced elegance that a casual observer might have mistaken it for a compliment. Caroline understood the blade hidden beneath the silk. She had grown up navigating drawing rooms where destruction was dealt in honeyed tones and raised eyebrows. "The ceremony was lovely," Caroline replied, her voice steady as marble. "I am grateful so many could witness the Count honoring me with his name." Evelyn's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. She had expected stammering, perhaps, defensive protests, not this serene, immovable composure. "His name," Charles repeated, savoring the word. "Yes, the Caro name does carry a certain historical weight. A pity it cannot be converted to currency. Names, I find, make poor currency when creditors come calling." "Charles." Nathaniel's voice dropped to something low and dangerous. "This is not the venue. Apologies, cousin. I merely wish to welcome your bride to the family." Charles's smile was all teeth, no warmth. "She should understand what she has married into. The grand Caro legacy. The ancestral seat falling to ruin. The debts that multiply like rabbits each passing season. It would be cruel to let her discover these truths alone, would it not?" Caroline's fingers pressed slightly harder against Nathaniel's arm, not in fear, but in silent command. She would handle this. She had not survived 27 years of genteel poverty to be dismantled by a sneering cousin and his poisonous wife. "I appreciate your concern for my well-being, Mr. Marbury," she said, her tone honey poured over ice. "But I entered this marriage with complete awareness of the Count's financial position. Unlike some, I do not require wealth to recognize value. A title is its own form of capital, one that compounds with time and proper management." Evelyn's fan stilled. For a fraction of a second, something flickered behind her carefully painted expression. Surprise, perhaps, or the dawning recognition that Caroline was not the easy prey she had anticipated. "How philosophical," Evelyn murmured. "I do hope philosophy keeps you warm when the fires cannot be lit at Caro Manor. I understand the chimneys have not been properly maintained in years. Then I shall have them repaired." Caroline smiled, the expression as fixed and unreadable as a porcelain mask. A countess should know how to manage a household, should she not? Even one in need of restoration. The exchange might have continued. Caroline could see Evelyn gathering another volley. But Nathaniel stepped forward, effectively ending the conversation with his body. "We must depart," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "The journey north is long, and we have delayed enough." Charles raised an eyebrow. "Leaving so soon? No wedding breakfast? No reception to celebrate the joyous union?" "The celebration," Nathaniel replied coldly, "is not your concern." He guided Caroline away before the Marburys could respond, his hand pressing firmly against the small of her back. She allowed herself to be steered toward the waiting carriage, though her mind remained fixed on the encounter, cataloguing every word, every inflection, every poorly concealed sneer. They thought her foolish, They thought she had bound herself to a drowning man and would be pulled beneath the waves alongside him. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps this marriage was nothing more than a gilded anchor dragging her toward ruin. But Caroline had learned, through years of watching her own family's slow decline, that ruin was not the worst fate. Obscurity was worse. Irrelevance was worse. Better to be a countess in a crumbling manor than a spinster in a forgotten drawing room, waiting for a proposal that would never come. The title was hers now, Countess Caro. No amount of Marbury mockery could strip it from her. As the carriage door closed behind them, sealing her inside with her silent, enigmatic husband, Caroline allowed herself one cold, private satisfaction. Evelyn and Charles would choke on their pity when she proved them wrong. She did not yet know how spectacularly that proof would come. She knew only that she would survive. She had purchased survival with her hand in marriage, and she intended to collect on every ounce of its worth. The Marburys could laugh, for now. The carriage crested the final hill on the third day, and Caroline saw her future laid out below like a cautionary tale carved into the Yorkshire moorland. Caro Manor sprawled against the grey horizon, a massive stone structure that had clearly once commanded respect, but now seemed to be slowly surrendering to the earth that surrounded it. The approach was lined with ancient oaks, their branches tangled and untended, creating a tunnel of shadows that swallowed the dying afternoon light. Through gaps in the canopy, Caroline glimpsed the estate's grounds. Overgrown gardens reduced to wilderness, stone walls crumbling like broken teeth, fountains choked with dead leaves, and darker things she chose not to examine too closely. "Welcome to your new home, Countess." Nathaniel's voice was devoid of irony, which somehow made the statement worse. He was not mocking her, he was simply stating fact. This ruin was her prize. The carriage wheels crunched over gravel desperately in need of fresh laying, each pothole jolting Caroline against the worn seats. She kept her expression neutral, her hands folded calmly in her lap, though inside she was rapidly recalculating. She had expected austerity. She had not expected abandonment. As they pulled to a stop before the manor's main entrance, a figure emerged from the shadows of the doorway. He was not a footman. There were no footmen, Caroline realized with sinking clarity. This was a man shaped by decades of physical labor, his shoulders broad, his hands scarred, his face weathered into something between leather and stone. "Marshal Keaton," Nathaniel said quietly. And Caroline heard something in his voice she had not heard before, genuine warmth, perhaps even relief. "My steward." Keaton approached the carriage with measured steps, his grey eyes taking in Caroline with an assessment that felt almost military in its thoroughness. When he opened the door and offered his hand to help her descend, she noticed his fingers were steady as iron, calloused but clean. "Countess," he said, the single word carrying neither welcome nor rejection. Simply acknowledgement. "Mr. Keaton." Caroline accepted his assistance, her boots finding uncertain purchase on the weed-cracked stones. "I understand you have been maintaining the estate in the Count's absence." Something flickered in Keaton's expression, surprise, perhaps, that she had addressed him directly. "I've kept what could be kept, my lady. The bones are sound, the rest—" He trailed off, his meaning clear in the gesture that encompassed the visible decay. Nathaniel descended behind her, and Caroline noticed how Keaton's posture shifted subtly. Not quite deference, but something deeper. Loyalty, perhaps. The kind that could not be bought, only earned through years of shared burden. "I'll need a complete assessment," Nathaniel said quietly. "Tonight, after the Countess has settled." "Already prepared, my lord." The exchange was brief, practiced, laden with subtext Caroline could not yet decode. She filed it away with all the other mysteries accumulating around her husband like fog. The interior of the manor was, if possible, more devastating than the exterior. The entrance hall soared 3 stories, its painted ceiling now water-stained and peeling. Furniture sat shrouded in dust cloths like ghosts of better days. The air smelled of damp stone and abandonment, thick enough to taste. Caroline moved through the space with deliberate composure, her footsteps echoing against bare floors where carpets had clearly been sold. She paused before a portrait hanging askew on the wall. Some long-dead Caro ancestor, his painted eyes seeming to judge her for witnessing the family's decline. "The east wing is sealed," Nathaniel said behind her, his tone matter-of-fact. "Unsafe. The west wing is habitable, though barely. Your rooms have been prepared there. My rooms." She turned to face him, noting the careful distance he maintained. "And yours? The North Tower. It has always been the Count's residence. Separate wings, separate lives." The arrangement should have relieved her. She had not married for intimacy. Yet something about the vast, echoing space between them felt heavier than mere distance. "I should like to see the household accounts," Caroline said, surprising both men. "Tomorrow, if possible. If I am to be mistress of this estate, I should understand its precise situation." Keaton's eyes shifted to Nathaniel, seeking permission. The Count's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The accounts are complex," Nathaniel said carefully. "I am not a child requiring protection from difficult truths." Caroline's voice carried the same steel she had used against the Marburys. "I married you understanding the estate was in distress. Let me understand the full extent, so I might contribute to its salvation." The 2 men exchanged another loaded glance, and Caroline felt the weight of secrets pressing against the walls. There was something here beyond mere poverty, something they were not telling her. She could feel it in the careful way Keaton moved, in the tension that radiated from Nathaniel whenever she asked direct questions. "Tomorrow," Nathaniel conceded finally. "Keaton will show you what there is to see." As she was led to her quarters, a suite of rooms that had clearly been hastily cleaned but could not hide years of neglect, Caroline began her private inventory, not just of the physical decay, but of the mysteries. A steward who commanded unusual respect, a husband who kept himself locked away in a tower, an estate that felt less abandoned than deliberately emptied. She stood at her window, looking out over the wild moorland, stretching endlessly beneath a darkening sky, and made herself a promise. She would uncover whatever truth these stones were hiding. She had not married for love or comfort. She had married for survival and status. But perhaps, in this desolate place full of secrets, she might find something more valuable than either. She would find the truth, and she would find a way to make this ruin into something resembling victory. 3 weeks had passed since Caroline's arrival at Caro Manor, and she had catalogued every saleable item down to the last tarnished spoon. The inventory was devastating, barely enough to cover a month's worth of the most pressing debts. She needed something more substantial, some overlooked asset that might buy them time. The library had been her last hope. It was the one room that seemed untouched by the systematic selling off of the estate's valuables, perhaps because books, unless they were particularly rare, fetched little at auction, or perhaps because the library sat in the dangerous east wing, behind a door marked with Keaton's stern warning, "Unstable floors, my lady. The Count forbids entry." Caroline had waited until both men were occupied, Nathaniel surveying the tenant farms, Keaton accompanying him before she tested the door. It opened easily, too easily for something supposedly dangerous. The floors, when she tested them carefully, seemed solid enough. The library itself was a monument to neglect. Dust motes swirled in the pale morning light that struggled through grimy windows. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, packed with volumes that hadn't been touched in years. The air was thick with the smell of decomposing paper and old leather, tinged with something else, the sharp scent of recent disturbance, as though someone had been here recently, despite the warnings. Caroline moved methodically through the stacks, searching for anything valuable. Estate records that might reveal forgotten holdings, first editions that could be quietly sold, legal documents that might offer some leverage against creditors. Her fingers traced along spines, leaving trails in the dust, finding nothing but agricultural treatises and third-rate poetry. It was in the furthest corner, behind a shelf that had been deliberately positioned to obscure it, that she found the anomaly. A section of volumes that bore no dust at all. They had been handled recently, frequently, carefully. Her pulse quickened. The books themselves were unremarkable. Outdated texts on mining engineering, geological surveys of the Yorkshire moorland, treatises on mineral extraction. Strange reading for a bankrupt count. But it was the volume at the end that caught her attention. Unlike the others, it was locked. A small brass mechanism built into its spine. Caroline studied the lock, her mind racing. Why lock a book, unless it contained something worth protecting? She searched the nearby desk, finding it strewn with papers in Nathaniel's precise handwriting. Columns of figures that made no sense, calculations that seemed to measure distances and depths rather than monetary sums. The key was hidden in plain sight, tucked beneath the base of an ink pot that had clearly been moved recently. The lock clicked open with well-oiled ease. Inside, the book had been hollowed out, its pages cut away to create a hidden compartment. Within lay a single piece of parchment, aged and yellowed but carefully preserved. Caroline lifted it with trembling fingers, unfolding it slowly. It was a map, hand-drawn with meticulous detail, showing the Carrow estate, but from a perspective she didn't recognize. The surface landmarks were marked, the manor, the moorland, the old chapel ruins, but beneath them, drawn in fading red ink, was another landscape entirely. Tunnels, passages, chambers marked with symbols she couldn't decode, and at the center, deep beneath the eastern moorland, a series of caverns marked with a single word that made her breath catch. Orium. Gold. Caroline sank into the nearest chair, the map spreading across her lap, her mind reeling through the implications. This wasn't a map of what was. It was a map of what lay beneath. The surveys on mining, the calculations of depth and distance, Nathaniel's secretive meetings with Keaton, it all suddenly crystallized into a truth so staggering she could barely breathe. The Count wasn't protecting his poverty, he was protecting a fortune. But why? If gold existed beneath the estate, why live in penury? Why let the manor crumble? Why marry her? A woman of modest means, when he could have sold the rights and lived like a king. Unless he couldn't sell. Unless the secret was too dangerous to reveal. Caroline studied the map more carefully, noting the dates inscribed in the corners. 1747. 100 years ago, when the Crown was seizing estates, when Catholic landowners were being stripped of their holdings on the flimsiest pretexts. If gold had been discovered then, it would have been immediately claimed by the state. The Carrows would have lost everything, so they had hidden it. For a century they had kept the secret, each count passing it to the next, maintaining the fiction of poverty while sitting on untold wealth. And now Nathaniel carried that burden, that terrible secret that could still, even now, see them stripped of everything if the Crown discovered it. The sound of footsteps in the corridor jolted Caroline from her revelations. She quickly refolded the map, placed it back in the hollowed book, and locked it. The key went back beneath the inkpot. She grabbed a random volume on crop rotation and was apparently engrossed in it when the library door opened. Keaton stood in the doorway, his weathered face unreadable. "The East Wing is dangerous, my lady." "So I was told," Caroline replied, not looking up from her book. "Yet here I sit, quite unharmed." His eyes moved to the disturbed dust, the tracks her skirts had left across the floor. Then to the corner, where the locked book sat. Something shifted in his expression. Not anger, but assessment. Calculation. "The Count has returned," he said finally. "He wishes to speak with you." Caroline rose, smoothing her skirts, the book still in her hand, as though it were her only interest. "Then I shall attend him." As she passed Keaton in the doorway, he spoke quietly, so quietly she almost missed it. "Careful where you step, my lady. Some grounds are more dangerous than others." It was a warning. Or perhaps she thought as she made her way back to the inhabited wing, an invitation to be worthy of the secret she had just uncovered. The gold beneath Carrow Manor changed everything. But first, she had to decide what to do with the knowledge that her bankrupt husband was quite possibly the richest man in England. The moon was a silver blade cutting through Yorkshire's darkness when Caroline slipped from the manor. She had waited 3 nights since finding the map, studying it by candlelight until every line was burned into her memory, planning her route with the methodical precision of a general preparing for battle. She wore her darkest dress, a practical wool that wouldn't show dirt, and boots she had found in the servants' quarters. Sturdy things meant for real work, not the delicate affairs she had brought from London. The map, carefully copied onto a smaller piece of paper, was tucked against her stays. The original remained locked in its hollowed book, undisturbed. The moorland at night was alien territory, transformed from the merely desolate landscape she knew by day into something primordial and threatening. Wind howled across the heath, carrying the scent of wet earth and decomposing heather. Every shadow could hide a bog. Every sound might herald discovery. Caroline moved carefully, using the old chapel ruins as her first landmark. According to the map, she needed to travel northeast from there, following what had once been a drover's path, but was now barely a suggestion in the grass. Her feet found the ancient track more by instinct than sight, each step careful, measured. She had told no one of her intentions. Not Nathaniel, certainly. He would have forbidden it, or worse, revealed enough to make her complicit in whatever crime keeping the secret entailed. Not Keaton, though she suspected he knew she had found something in the library. His watchfulness had intensified these past days, though he said nothing. The path curved around a massive outcropping of limestone, and Caroline paused to check her copied map by moonlight. 20 paces north from the rock face, then down into a dell that was hidden from view, unless one knew precisely where to look. She counted her steps carefully, her breath misting in the cold air. The dell was there, exactly as marked, a sudden depression in the earth, as though God had pressed his thumb into the landscape. Caroline descended carefully, her boots sliding on loose shale, one hand trailing along the rough stone for balance. At the bottom, surrounded by jutting rocks that formed a natural concealment, she found what she was looking for. It appeared to be nothing more than a shadow, a darker place where 2 massive stones leaned against each other. But as Caroline approached, she saw the deliberate nature of it. The stones had been positioned to hide an opening, and that opening had been sealed with newer stonework, mortared carefully, but not recently. This barrier was perhaps 50 years old, weathered but solid, except someone had been here since, recently. A section of the mortared stones had been carefully removed and then replaced, like a door fitted back into its frame. Caroline pressed against it, and it swung inward on concealed hinges, revealing absolute darkness beyond. She had brought a small lantern stolen from the kitchen and matches wrapped in oiled cloth. Her hands shook only slightly as she lit it, the flame catching and casting wild shadows on the cave walls. She stepped inside. The passage was narrow at first, carved from living rock, the walls bearing the scars of pickaxes and chisels. But as she moved deeper, it widened, and the rough walls gave way to something more deliberate. A proper tunnel, shored up with massive timber beams that had aged to iron hardness. The air grew warmer as she descended, thick with a metallic taste that coated the back of her throat. The tunnel branched, but the main passage was obvious from the worn groove in the floor where countless feet, or perhaps carts, had passed. Caroline followed it, her lantern held high, her heart hammering against her ribs. She heard it before she saw it, the soft musical sound of water dripping. The tunnel opened suddenly into a natural cavern, and Caroline stopped breathing. The lantern light caught it first as mere glimmers, sparks of brilliance in the dark. But as her eyes adjusted, she saw the truth of it. The walls were veined with gold, not the subtle threads she had imagined, but thick, rope-like deposits that twisted through the rock like frozen lightning. The ceiling glittered with it. The very ground beneath her feet was scattered with nuggets that had fallen naturally from the walls. Caroline sank to her knees, not in reverence but in shock. She picked up a piece of gold the size of a quail's egg, hefting its surprising weight. It was real. Absolutely, undeniably real. And there was so much of it. The cavern extended beyond her lantern's reach, but everywhere the light touched revealed more. This wasn't a mine that had been exhausted. It had barely been touched. A fortune. No, 1,000 fortunes. Enough to buy half of England. A sound echoed through the tunnel behind her, and Caroline's blood turned to ice. Footsteps, measured and deliberate. She extinguished her lantern immediately, plunging herself into darkness so complete it felt solid. Her hand closed around the gold nugget, an instinctive act of possession, or perhaps evidence. She pressed herself against the cavern wall, barely breathing, as light approached from the tunnel. Not the warm glow of a lantern, but the steadier beam of a proper mining lamp. The footsteps stopped at the cavern entrance. "I know you're there, my lady." Keaton's voice calm and unsurprised. Caroline remained silent, her mind racing through possibilities, escapes, explanations. "The Count will want to speak with you," he continued. "Best you come willing. The moorland is treacherous at night for those who don't know its ways." Caroline straightened, gathering what dignity she could in the darkness. "Then light your lamp properly, Mr. Keaton. I would prefer not to stumble on the way back." His chuckle was dry as autumn leaves. "You're more like him than you know, my lady. Too clever by half, and too brave for your own good." As light flooded the cavern again, Caroline saw Keaton's face, not angry, but almost approving. She had passed some test she didn't know she was taking. She followed him back through the tunnel, the gold nugget still clenched in her fist, knowing that everything had changed. She was no longer the woman who had married a bankrupt count for his title. She was the woman who knew where the gold was buried, and that, she suspected, was worth more than any title in the realm. Nathaniel was waiting in his study, a room Caroline had never entered before. It occupied the base of the North Tower, circular and oppressive, its walls lined with legal documents and ledgers that suddenly made terrible sense. He stood with his back to her, staring into a fire that did little to warm the stone chamber. "Leave us, Keaton." His voice was controlled, but Caroline heard the strain beneath it, like ice beginning to crack under spring's insistence. The steward withdrew, closing the heavy door with deliberate softness. The sound of the latch falling was final as a coffin lid. Caroline waited, the gold nugget still pressed against her palm, its edges cutting into her skin. She had rehearsed accusations, demands, clever words to force his hand. But faced with his rigid back, the weight of his silence, she found herself saying simply, "How long have you known I would search for it?" He turned then, and she saw exhaustion etched into every line of his face. Not the exhaustion of one night's lost sleep, but of years carrying an impossible weight alone. "Since you survived the first week without complaint, since you catalogued our poverty with the precision of a banker, since you looked at this ruin and saw a puzzle to solve rather than a prison to endure." He paused. "You are not what I expected, Caroline." It was the first time he had used her given name. The intimacy of it in his careful voice made her breath catch. "The gold," she said, holding up the nugget. "There's enough to restore the estate 100 times over. Why?" "Sit." It wasn't a command, but a plea. She sank into the chair across from his desk, watching as he poured brandy with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. He offered her a glass. She accepted it but didn't drink. "The year was 1747, he began, his voice taking on the cadence of a story told many times in the darkness of private thought. "My great-great-grandfather, the 8th Count, discovered the gold by accident. A collapsed section of moorland revealed the first vein. Within days he understood what he had found. Within weeks he understood the danger of it." Nathaniel moved to the wall, pulling down a leather portfolio thick with documents. The Crown had just seized 3 estates that year. Catholic sympathies were the official reason, but everyone knew the truth. The Crown needed money for its wars. Any excuse would serve. He spread papers across the desk, official seizure notices, legal precedents, accounts of families destroyed. If word of the gold had reached London, we would have lost everything, not just the wealth, but the land, the title, our very name. Caroline studied the documents, her quick mind grasping the implications. So he hid it. He buried it deeper than it already was, sealed the entrances, swore his most trusted men to secrecy, and then he did the cleverest thing of all. Nathaniel's smile was bitter. He began to live as though he were poor. Sold off small holdings, dismissed servants, let parts of the manor fall into disrepair. He created the fiction that the Caro fortune was failing. And every count since has maintained the lie. We had no choice to... The Hanoverian kings were no better than the Stuarts when it came to seizing wealth. Then came the war with France, and the crown grew even hungrier. By the time my father inherited, the deception had become our prison. We sat on a fortune that could never be touched. Caroline set down her untouched brandy. But surely now, with proper legal counsel, mineral rights could be established. Could they? Nathaniel's laugh was hollow. "I have spent 10 years studying every legal precedent. The Crown's right to precious metals is ancient and absolute. At best, we might keep a fraction. At worst..." He gestured to the seizure documents. "We would lose everything, and the Marburys of the world would feast on our bones." The mention of his sneering cousins made Caroline's jaw tighten. She thought of Evelyn's pitying smile, Charles's condescension. They thought Nathaniel weak, ruined. They had no idea he was sitting on enough gold to buy their entire existence 1,000 times over. "So, you married me," Caroline said slowly. "A woman of modest means, maintaining the fiction of poverty. I married you because I had to marry someone, and you..." He stopped, seeming to wrestle with words. You asked for nothing except the title. You didn't simper or scheme or pretend affection. You were ruthlessly honest about the transaction. I thought that would make it easier. Easier. To keep the secret. To maintain the necessary distance. To protect you from the burden of knowing. His eyes met hers, dark and intense. I failed rather spectacularly in that regard. Caroline stood, moving to the desk, her fingers trailing across the damning documents. You cannot carry this alone anymore. I know now. That cannot be undone. You could forget. Pretend you saw nothing. Live as the countess you wanted to be, with the allowance we can safely provide. Stop. The word cracked like a whip. You insult me. Do you think I survived 27 years of genteel poverty, watched my family slowly drowning in debt, negotiated my own marriage contract, only to play the ignorant wife now? I know what I saw. I know what it means. And I know what it could cost us both. Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, and she saw him truly, for perhaps the first time. Not the cold, bankrupt count she had married, but a man who had lived his entire life guarding a secret that could destroy everything he was sworn to protect. Then we are allies, he said finally. Partners in this deception. Partners? Caroline tested the word, finding it inadequate. They were more than partners now. They were conspirators, bound by shared knowledge that could hang them both. Tell me everything, every detail, every danger, every person who might suspect. If we are to protect this secret, I need to know all of it. Nathaniel poured himself another brandy, this time drinking deeply. Then we begin with my father's journal. And Caroline. He paused, her name still unfamiliar on his lips. Once you know everything, there is no returning to ignorance. Are you certain? She thought of the gold veining through the rock like frozen fire, of the weight of wealth beyond imagining, of the danger that came with such knowledge. She thought of the man before her, carrying this burden alone for so long that it had carved permanent lines into his face. I am your wife, she said simply. Your secrets are mine now, whether we chose it or not. Something shifted in his expression. Relief, perhaps, or recognition. He had married her for convenience, but he had gained something far more valuable. An ally who understood the true weight of the Caro legacy. The alliance was forged in that moment, not with vows or rings, but with shared understanding of the beautiful, terrible secret that bound them together more surely than any marriage contract ever could. The dawn mist clung to the moorland as Caroline descended into the concealed workshop Keaton had fashioned in what had once been the manor's wine cellars. For 2 weeks now, she had risen before the sun, slipping through the sleeping house like a ghost in wool and determination. The transformation of the space still amazed her. Where once there had been empty racks and dust, now stood tables covered with maps, geological surveys, and careful calculations in 3 different hands. You're late, Keaton observed without looking up from the ore sample he was examining. His tone held no reproach, merely the dry amusement she had come to recognize as approval. The household accounts required attention, Caroline replied, removing her cloak. Mrs. Morrison grows suspicious when expenses don't align with visible purchases. I've had to invent a theoretical roof repair to explain the additional timber we've required. Clever, Nathaniel said from the corner where he worked, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, a streak of dirt across his jaw that made him look younger, less burdened. Though, we'll need to actually repair something to maintain the fiction. Caroline moved to the table where their extraction plans lay spread like battle strategies. The east chimney, perhaps. It's visible from the road, and genuinely needs work. We could hide material movements under the guise of restoration. She felt, rather than saw, Nathaniel move to stand beside her, close enough that she caught the scent of his soap beneath the earthier smell of their work. These proximities had become frequent, shoulders brushing as they leaned over documents, fingers touching as they passed tools or papers, moments of contact that lingered a heartbeat longer than necessary. The extraction itself isn't the primary challenge, Keaton said, joining them at the table. We can bring out enough gold to sustain the estate indefinitely, if we're careful. It's the conversion that presents difficulties. Raw gold raises questions. We need a plausible source for sudden wealth. Caroline had been thinking about this for days, turning the problem over in her mind like a jeweler examining a stone for flaws. What about inheritance? She suggested. A deceased relative in the Americas. Distant enough that no one would know them personally, recent enough to explain why the funds are only now arriving. Nathaniel's eyes sharpened with interest. It would need documentation, letters, legal papers, a trail that could withstand scrutiny. I can forge those, Caroline said quietly. Both men turned to stare at her, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. My father taught me. Before his debts grew too large, he was a solicitor's clerk. He showed me how documents were constructed, authenticated. I thought it might be useful someday, though I never imagined for something like this. Keaton's weathered face cracked into what might have been a smile. You continue to surprise, my lady. The surprise, Nathaniel said, his voice carrying something warm and unfamiliar, is that I ever thought I was marrying a mere ornament for my ancestral home. The compliment, understated as it was, made Caroline's pulse quicken. She covered her reaction by focusing on the papers before them. We'll need to establish the relative first. Create a history. My great-aunt Prudence actually did have a brother who traveled to Virginia in 1789. He disappeared somewhere near Richmond. We could build from that truth. Brilliant, Nathaniel murmured. And when she glanced at him, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Admiration, certainly, but something else. Something that made the cellar feel suddenly warm despite the morning chill. They worked in concentrated silence for the next hour, each absorbed in their designated tasks. Caroline crafted the narrative of their fictional benefactor, building a life from carefully chosen details. Nathaniel worked through the legal implications, his knowledge of property law proving invaluable. Keaton calculated extraction rates, amounts small enough to avoid suspicion, but large enough to matter. It was Caroline who noticed Nathaniel rubbing his shoulder, the third time in as many minutes. You're hurt, she said, not a question. It's nothing. I strained it yesterday, moving the beam in the lower tunnel. Before she could think better of it, Caroline moved behind him, her hands finding the knot of tension in his shoulder. He stiffened at her touch, then slowly, incrementally, relaxed as her fingers worked against the muscle. My mother suffered from rheumatism, she said quietly, needing to fill the suddenly charged silence. I learned to help with the pain. She felt him exhale, a long, careful breath. Your hands are surprisingly strong. Surprising seems to be my primary characteristic these days. His hand came up to cover hers, stilling her movement. For a moment they remained frozen like that, her hands on his shoulders, his hand over hers, the warmth of connection spreading between them like spilled wine. Keaton cleared his throat, and they separated quickly. Caroline returning to her papers with burning cheeks, Nathaniel straightening his shoulders as though nothing had occurred. The transportation routes need consideration, Keaton said, diplomatic in his interruption. We can't use the main roads consistently. Too visible. Caroline forced her mind back to practical matters. The old drovers' paths. I've been mapping them during my morning rides. Most are overgrown, but passable. We could move materials at night. Claim we're surveying for agricultural improvements if anyone asks. You've been riding alone. Nathaniel's voice carried a sharp edge of concern. I'm perfectly capable. I don't doubt your capability. I question the wisdom of the Countess of Carrow wandering the moors unaccompanied when we're sitting on a secret that could destroy us. The protective anger in his voice surprised her. This wasn't about propriety or appearances. This was genuine concern for her safety. Then ride with me, she said, meeting his gaze directly. Tomorrow morning. We can survey the routes together. Something shifted in his expression. A wall coming down brick by careful brick. At dawn, then. Keaton looked between them with an expression that might have been satisfaction. Best you learn to work as one, he said gruffly. This secret will either bind you together or tear you apart. There's no middle ground with something this dangerous. As Caroline climbed the stairs back to the main house, she could still feel the warmth of Nathaniel's hand over hers, the solid strength of his shoulder beneath her fingers. They had married as strangers conducting a business transaction, but here, in the secret depths of the manor, working toward a shared purpose, something else was being forged. Partnership, certainly. Trust, gradually. And perhaps, though neither would name it yet, something that had nothing to do with gold and everything to do with the careful way they were learning to move in each other's orbit, drawn together by more than just the secret they shared. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a Crown courier whose scarlet livery was visible from Caroline's window long before he reached the manor. She watched him approach with the same sick fascination one might observe a snake sliding toward a nest of mice. Keaton intercepted the courier at the door, accepting the official packet with his customary stoicism. But Caroline saw his weathered hand tighten fractionally on the parchment, saw the almost imperceptible shift in his posture that meant trouble. By the time he brought the letter to Nathaniel's study, she was already there. Having moved with silent urgency through the corridors, Nathaniel broke the seal, his face going carefully blank as he read. That blankness was worse than anger would have been. Caroline had learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression, the way his jaw tightened when he was calculating odds, the way his eyes went distant when faced with something he couldn't immediately solve. "What is it?" she asked, though dread was already pooling cold in her stomach. He handed her the letter without a word. The paper was heavy, expensive, bearing the official watermark of the Crown's Office of Revenue and Properties. But it was the signature at the bottom that made Caroline's breath catch. Henry Blackwell, acting in his capacity as junior auditor for Yorkshire Holdings. Henry, her former suitor. The man who had courted her with practiced charm and empty promises before disappearing the moment he learned her dowry was negligible. She had thought herself well rid of him. She forced herself to read the formal language with the same precision she brought to their forgery work. The letter was a masterpiece of bureaucratic threat disguised as routine inquiry. It cited irregularities in property assessments, mentioned reports of undisclosed assets, and concluded with the devastating news that a Crown inspector would arrive within the fortnight to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of the Carrow estate's true value for purposes of equitable taxation and debt reconciliation. "The Marburys," Caroline said flatly. "This has their fingerprints all over it." "Undoubtedly," Nathaniel's voice was ice over steel. "They've been poking at our finances for months trying to find leverage. Somehow, they've enlisted your Mr. Blackwell to give their spite official backing." "He's not my—" Caroline stopped herself. The clarification was irrelevant. He must have approached them, or they him. Either way, they found each other. Keaton, who had remained standing by the door like a sentinel, spoke quietly. "This is more than spite, my lord. The language about undisclosed assets. Someone has heard something. A rumor. A whisper. The three of them exchanged weighted glances. They had been so careful. The extraction work happened only at night. The materials moved through hidden paths, every transaction documented with meticulous false trails. But secrets of this magnitude were like water finding cracks in stone. Eventually, they seeped through. "How much time do we have?" Caroline asked, her mind already racing through possibilities. "The letter is dated 5 days ago," Nathaniel said. "Travel from London would take another 3. We have perhaps a week, maybe less, before the inspector arrives. Can we refuse entry? Only if we want to guarantee immediate seizure." He began pacing, the movement tight and controlled. "Refusing a Crown inspection is tantamount to admission of guilt. We have no choice but to allow it." Caroline moved to the window, watching storm clouds gather over the moorland. A week. 7 days to hide a gold mine from professional investigators who would be looking specifically for hidden wealth. The impossibility of it threatened to overwhelm her. "We need to know exactly what they suspect," she said, turning back to face the men. "The letter mentions reports, plural. Someone has been talking or someone has seen something. We need to identify the leak before the inspector arrives." "There are only 3 of us who know the full truth," Keaton said, his tone making it clear he found the suggestion of betrayal offensive. "But there are others who might have noticed oddities," Caroline countered. "Mrs. Morrison commenting on our supply purchases, the tenant farmers who have seen us riding the moors at odd hours. Any one of them might have mentioned something innocuous that the Marburys twisted into evidence." Nathaniel stopped pacing, his expression sharpening. "You're right. We need to control the narrative before the inspector arrives. Give him something to find that explains any irregularities." "The American inheritance," Caroline said immediately. "We were planning to establish it gradually, but we accelerate the timeline. Create documented proof that we've recently come into modest funds through legitimate channels, enough to explain new purchases and improved circumstances, but not enough to draw deeper scrutiny." "Modest is the operative word," Keaton added. "Too much wealth appearing suddenly would raise exactly the questions we're trying to avoid." Nathaniel returned to his desk, pulling out the forged documents Caroline had been crafting. "Can you complete these in a week? Make them perfect enough to withstand professional examination?" Caroline studied the papers, mentally calculating what needed to be done. Age the ink, create corresponding bank drafts, forge notary seals, construct letters of correspondence that would establish a timeline. "Yes," she said, though her stomach churned at the enormity of the task. "But I'll need access to better materials. The seal impressions alone require equipment we don't have." "There's a printer in Leeds who owes me a favor," Keaton said quietly. "He's discreet. For the right price, he can provide what you need without questions." "Send him word today," Nathaniel instructed. Then, to Caroline. "What else?" She moved to the desk, laying out the documents systematically. "We need physical evidence. A letter from the fictional American solicitor, dated appropriately. Bank statements showing the transfer of funds, modest amounts, as we discussed. Perhaps a few pieces of jewelry or silverware that could plausibly have been inherited. Small luxuries that explain recent purchases without suggesting vast wealth." "I have my grandmother's jewelry in storage," Nathaniel said. "Pieces I kept hidden from creditors. We can claim they were part of the inheritance, returned to the family." Caroline nodded, her mind constructing the elaborate deception layer by layer. It was like building a house of cards in a hurricane, but it was their only option. "What about Henry?" she asked quietly. "He knows me. Knows I had no American relatives of means." Nathaniel's eyes met hers, dark and intense. "Then you'll need to convince him he was wrong, that there were family connections he never knew about. Can you do that?" Caroline thought of Henry's practiced charm, his calculating eyes that had assessed her worth like a merchant examining inferior goods. She had felt humiliated when he withdrew his suit. Now she felt only cold determination. "I can lie to him," she said simply. "I've had excellent practice in deception lately." Something flickered in Nathaniel's expression, approval mixed with what might have been concern. "This is dangerous, Caroline. If they catch us in the fraud, it won't just be the gold we lose. Forging legal documents, lying to crown officials, these are serious crimes. More serious than hiding a gold mine from the crown." She kept her voice steady, though fear coiled in her chest like a living thing. "We're already committed to this deception. Now we simply need to be better at it than they are at uncovering it." Keaton moved from his position by the door, joining them at the desk. "The lady's right. We've been protecting this secret for 100 years. A week under scrutiny won't break us, if we're smart." Nathaniel looked between them, his fierce steward and his unexpectedly cunning wife, and Caroline saw the moment he made his decision. "Then we begin immediately. Keaton, secure the materials from Leeds. Caroline, finish the documentation. I'll prepare the physical evidence and arrange the house to suggest modest improvement without excess." As they dispersed to their tasks, Caroline felt the weight of what they were attempting settle onto her shoulders. 7 days to construct a lie comprehensive enough to fool Crown investigators. 7 days before Henry Blackwell arrived with the Marburys' malice backing him, seeking to expose what he believed was Nathaniel's ruin. He would find something, Caroline resolved, but it wouldn't be ruin. It would be a carefully constructed fiction so perfect that questioning it would seem absurd. The trap had been set for them. Now they would turn it into theatre and pray that their performance was flawless enough to save them all. The Crown Inspector arrived precisely at noon on the 8th day, accompanied by Henry Blackwell and, to Caroline's cold fury, both Marburys. They came in a procession of 3 carriages, as though arriving for a social call rather than an inquisition. Caroline watched from the drawing-room window as they descended onto the gravel drive, Evelyn's ostrich plumes bobbing with each step, Charles's expression smug with anticipated triumph. Henry looked exactly as she remembered. Handsome in that calculated way some men cultivated, his smile practiced, his movements designed to charm. Seeing him now, knowing what she knew about Nathaniel's quiet strength and hidden burdens, Henry seemed almost laughably shallow. "They've brought witnesses," Nathaniel observed from beside her, his voice controlled but tight. "Planning to make a spectacle of our humiliation." "Then we'll give them a spectacle," Caroline replied, smoothing her gown. She wore deep green silk, one of the pieces from her London trousseau that she had kept pristine for exactly this purpose. Around her neck hung a delicate gold locket, part of Nathaniel's grandmother's collection, now serving as proof of their fictional inheritance. Just not the one they're expecting. The formal Crown Inspector was a thin man named Pemberton, with wire spectacles and the officious manner of someone who had elevated procedural compliance to an art form. He carried a leather case bulging with documents and wore an expression of profound skepticism. Keaton showed them into the drawing room where Caroline and Nathaniel waited with the calm of people who had nothing to hide. The room had been carefully staged, comfortable but not ostentatious, showing signs of recent modest improvements without suggesting excess. Fresh curtains, a repaired chair, small touches that spoke of a household slowly recovering its footing. "Count Caro, Countess." Pemberton inclined his head with minimal courtesy. "I trust you received notification of this inquiry." "We did," Nathaniel replied evenly, "though I confess some confusion as to its necessity. Our affairs, while modest, are entirely in order." "Are they?" Henry stepped forward, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Caroline, forgive me. Countess Caro, you must understand our concern. When a household known to be drowning in debt suddenly begins purchasing supplies, making improvements, one naturally wonders about the source of such unexpected funds." Caroline met his gaze with perfect composure, allowing just a hint of pity to color her expression. "Mr. Blackwell, how kind of you to take such interest in our domestic affairs, though I confess your intelligence appears to be somewhat outdated." Evelyn's fan snapped open. "Outdated? My dear, we have it on excellent authority that your circumstances remain dire. Unless," her smile turned poisonous, "you've been concealing assets. That would be most unfortunate given the Crown's interest in such matters." "The only thing we've been concealing," Caroline said, moving to the escritoire with measured grace, "is our good fortune, out of respect for those less fortunate." She withdrew the carefully prepared documents, each one a masterpiece of forgery aged to perfection. "Perhaps you're unaware that my late great-uncle, Cornelius Whitford, emigrated to Virginia some 60 years ago." She watched Henry's eyes narrow with suspicion. "You never mentioned American relatives." "Why would I? Until 6 months ago, I believed Uncle Cornelius died childless and poor in Richmond. It was only after my marriage—" She glanced at Nathaniel, allowing warmth to enter her expression, "that his solicitor located me through genealogical records. It seems Uncle Cornelius made quite a success of tobacco farming. He never married, never had children, and specified in his will that his modest estate should return to his English relations." Pemberton accepted the documents with professional detachment, studying them with meticulous attention. Caroline had spent 7 sleepless nights ensuring their perfection. The will, notarized with a seal Keaton's contact in Leeds had provided. The letter from the Virginia solicitor, written on appropriately aged paper with American spellings and authentic postal marks. Bank drafts showing the transfer of funds, £1,500, enough to matter, but not enough to transform their circumstances dramatically. £1,500, Charles scoffed, barely enough to matter. Enough to repair our chimneys, replace worn furnishings, and settle some pressing debts, Nathaniel said quietly. "We're not claiming wealth, merely a modest improvement in our circumstances, hardly the stuff of scandal." Pemberton continued his examination, checking dates, studying signatures, comparing the documents against whatever standards he carried in his methodical mind. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the ticking of the mantel clock and Evelyn's agitated fan. Henry moved closer to Caroline, his voice dropping to something meant to sound intimate. "This is quite convenient, isn't it? An inheritance appearing precisely when questions arise about your finances." Caroline met his eyes with steel beneath silk. "Convenient would have been inheriting before I was forced to marry for a title rather than affection. Though I confess, Mr. Blackwell, I'm grateful for how things transpired. My marriage, entered into from necessity, has proven far more valuable than any inheritance." She felt rather than saw Nathaniel's attention sharpen on her. The words were part of their performance, designed to sell the fiction of a marriage entered desperately but matured into something genuine. Yet as she spoke them, Caroline realized they carried more truth than she had intended. "The documents appear authentic," Pemberton announced finally, though his tone suggested disappointment. "The solicitor's seal matches Virginia registry records, the bank drafts clear through appropriate channels. I see no evidence of forgery." "Because there wasn't any, or rather, the forgery was too perfect to detect." Caroline kept her expression serene, while her heart hammered against her ribs. "However," Pemberton continued, "I'll need to inspect the estate thoroughly." Ensure the improvements match the reported expenditures. Verify that no other assets have been concealed." "Of course," Nathaniel said smoothly. "Mr. Keaton will provide you full access to our accounts and properties. We have nothing to hide." For the next 3 hours, Pemberton conducted his inspection with grinding thoroughness, accompanied by a silent, increasingly frustrated Henry. They examined the repaired east chimney, the replaced kitchen supplies, the modest improvements to the stables. Keaton produced receipts for everything, each one meticulously documented and entirely legitimate, because they had actually made the improvements using carefully extracted gold converted through channels that left no trace back to the mine. The secret tunnels remained sealed behind their concealed entrances. The gold stayed hidden beneath tons of moorland stone. The wine cellar showed only wine racks and dust, their workshop having been dismantled days ago, every tool and document removed to a new location deeper in the estate's hidden geography. When Pemberton finally closed his leather case, his expression was that of a man who had expected revelation and found only tedious accuracy. "Everything appears in order, Lord Carrow. The inheritance is documented, the expenditures justified, the improvements modest and appropriate. I see no evidence of concealed assets or financial irregularity." The Marburys' faces were studies in thwarted malice. Henry's jaw tightened with barely suppressed frustration. "There must be something," Evelyn insisted shrilly. "They were destitute mere months ago. They received a modest inheritance. Properly documented and legally transferred," Pemberton said with the finality of a man whose professional standards had been satisfied. "Unless you have specific evidence of wrongdoing, Lady Marbury, I suggest you redirect your energies elsewhere." As the carriages finally pulled away, carrying their disappointed inquisitors back to London, Caroline felt her knees weaken with relief. Only Nathaniel's hand suddenly at her elbow kept her upright. "Steady," he murmured, his voice carrying warmth she had never heard before. "They're gone. We're safe." They stood in the doorway, watching the carriages disappear into the distance, Keaton a silent, approving presence behind them. When the last trace of dust had settled, Nathaniel turned to Caroline, his hand still supporting her arm. "That was extraordinary," he said quietly. "The way you handled Henry, the documents, the performance, all of it. I have never seen anything so perfectly executed." "We executed it," Caroline corrected. "All 3 of us." "No." His hand moved from her elbow to her face, his thumb brushing her cheek with startling tenderness. "You were magnificent. I married you for a title, for convenience, for duty. I had no idea I was gaining a partner who would risk everything to protect what we've built." Caroline's breath caught. "What we've built isn't just the secret, is it?" "No." His eyes searched hers, and she saw in them everything they had been too careful to name. Somewhere between the gold and the forgery, between the fear and the partnership, I stopped seeing you as the woman I married from necessity. You've become the woman I would choose, Caroline. If I had the chance to do it again, knowing everything, I would still choose you." She reached up, her hand covering his where it rested against her face. "I married you for a title. I stayed for the secret. But I love you for the man you are. The one who carries impossible burdens with quiet strength, who trusted me with the truth, who stands beside me against the world." He kissed her then, not with the polite distance of their wedding day, but with the intensity of a man claiming what was truly his. And Caroline kissed him back, sealing with passion what had been forged in partnership. When they finally broke apart, Keaton had diplomatically disappeared, leaving them alone in the doorway of their defended home. "So," Nathaniel said, his forehead resting against hers. The countess who married for a title has become the richest woman in England. And the count who married for duty has gained something worth more than gold. What's that? Caroline smiled, genuine and radiant. A wife who knows where the bodies are buried and loves you anyway. His laugh was deep and unguarded, a sound she realized she had never heard before. Come, he said, taking her hand. Let's celebrate our victory properly. I believe we've earned it. As they walked back into Carrow Manor, their fortress, their secret, their shared legacy, Caroline reflected that she had indeed married for a title. But she had gained a partnership, a purpose, and a love that no amount of gold could purchase. The secret would bind them forever, but it was love that would sustain them through whatever came next. The end.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.